If there's one good thing to come from the whole Microsoft, Activision, Sony fiasco, it's that Sony's intentions are now completely out in the open. Microsoft has literally made every possible bit of insurance available to Sony during the attempted takeover of Activision, and Sony is still committed to looking like a third grader at the end of recess, refusing to come back into the classroom. This meme sums it up pretty perfectly, and it's made all the more perfect because it was tweeted out by one of the Activision higher-ups.
Oh, that's gotta hurt.
A lot of people seem to think that the Activision acquisition is like a hostile takeover by Microsoft, but that really couldn't be further from the truth. And frankly, if Sony doesn't pull their head out of their butt fast, they may sever any kind of working relationship they ever have with the COD publisher. And yes, I said but because I don't know if I'm past the no swearing point of the video yet, and I would like to keep my monetization. Microsoft really is doing their best to be open and transparent about their intentions with Activision and all of its IP, and Sony has obviously been pretty terrified at the prospect of not being able to hold third-party content hostage instead of, actually finding ways to entice buyers to their platform organically, like how this is supposed to work. But a recent article from Metro presented a different off-ramp to all this drama. What if Sony just buys Xbox? And now that I'm definitely past the no swearing point of this video, I can confidently say that this is the dumbest fucking idea I've heard in a long time. I'm not gonna stall any longer because this heaping pile of dog vomit just speaks for itself, so let's just read this. Over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about Microsoft losing its grip on its Xbox business, with people talking about the possibility of it quitting the games industry. Sorry, it's just so stupid. With people talking about the possibility of it quitting the games industry entirely, or stopping making all of its games day one on Game Pass. I'm not sure with what seriousness those suggestions were made, but it's obvious why they've arisen now, rather than at any other time in the recent past, as Microsoft makes an exhibition of itself in its flailing attempts to buy Activision Blizzard. Couple things here. Let's just lay the groundwork. This is how much fucking money Microsoft is worth. This is how much fucking money Sony is worth. And I want you to remember this as we keep going through this video, because as long as you have those two numbers in mind, this entire article just doesn't work. I also love the thing that people do where they're like, here's this really absurd claim. I don't know why people are making this absurd claim. Like, if you think it's a mockable and, illegitimate thing that people are saying, why are you presenting it as if it's normal? Could it be that you are one of the people who say these things and you are trying to manufacture some kind of argument from authority? That couldn't possibly be the case. Anyone who thinks Xbox is going to quit the gaming industry, fucking grow up. That's not going to happen. Xbox may not be the biggest brand in gaming, but they're one of the biggest brands in gaming by a landslide. Just because they're not number one doesn't mean that they're not valuable or they're not successful, Also, if Xbox were even considering quitting the games industry, why would they be trying to acquire Activision? Fucking think for a second.
Think, Mark!
And I'm no fan of Xbox. I think I've made it very clear in recent videos that I have very negative opinions of modern Microsoft. So if I'm coming to Xbox's defense, fucking yikes. I have no idea if the acquisition is going to go through. It's just full stop. It will. It will go through. The acquisition absolutely will go through. There is no legal ground against it. And Microsoft has made it clear that they're absolutely willing to prove that there is no legal ground against it. Microsoft absolutely will acquire Activision. It's going to happen. The only thing that's up in the air at this point is how many relationships are going to be severed along the way. Since they're incomparably rich, I thought it went without saying that they would get what they want. Oh boy, so you're one of those people. Cool. But if nothing else, they're certainly being made to sweat it out. I guess the most likely outcome is that they're forced to make even more concessions to Sony, potentially making the deal not worth the trouble. Again, that's not going to happen. There's no legal reason for that to happen. Sony being so vehemently against the acquisition really means nothing to Microsoft. If Microsoft was worried about offending Sony or upsetting Sony along the way of this acquisition, they wouldn't have started. Microsoft doesn't give a shit. And the whole reason why Sony is now just putting their hands in their pockets and staying silent on the whole thing is because A, they have no argument, and B, they've dug their grave enough with this. Sony was betting on their ability to just raise a stink and have other people do the dirty work for them. But now that Microsoft has been standing up and being like, no, you can't raise a stink about this, especially when you're fucking hypocrites, which Sony is. Literally everything that Sony says Microsoft might do with this acquisition, all of those accusations are things Sony either have already done or are actively doing. And Microsoft has made it clear that they're not willing to just sit by and let Sony act like this and block their acquisition. Because again, there's no actual legal or business ground for them to get away with that. Sony's raising a big stink that Microsoft might make third-party content exclusive to the Xbox, as if Sony hasn't been doing that for decades already. Sony's not actually upset about third-party console exclusivity, they're just upset that they're losing the PlayStation content exclusivity for certain games, like Call of Duty. Why do you think this meme is so relevant? Sony's whole argument was, oh, we might lose Call of Duty, oh, it's going to be anti-competitive. Then Microsoft comes out and is like, look, here's an actual guarantee we won't do that, will you shut the fuck up now? That's literally all that's happened. I guess you could argue that they've been doing kind of lame shit with Bethesda games, and I agree that they've been doing lame shit with Bethesda games. I see no reason why all Bethesda games shouldn't be coming to PlayStation. I see no reason why Starfield and Elder Scrolls 6 shouldn't be coming to PlayStation. But then again, I don't understand why games like Final Fantasy 16 shouldn't be coming to Xbox. Final Fantasy 15 was on Xbox, why isn't Final Fantasy 16? Both companies are guilty of third-party console exclusivity. And that's why the Activision deal absolutely will go through. Sony shot themselves in the foot with this. Even if it does go through, it will. They've wasted the last year hammering it out, and their games lineup has clearly suffered as a result. You might say it's a coincidence that while all the Activision Blizzard stuff has been going on, Microsoft has released no games of note, but the other recurring news story over the last year has been of poor management across multiple Xbox studios. True or not, nothing's being produced at the moment, and I feel Microsoft is beginning to lose its grip of the situation. Now here's where I start to agree with you, but also you've lost me in the process of me agreeing with you. Microsoft has spent the last year hammering it out because Sony is the one prolonging it. If it were up to Microsoft, the deal would have been done and signed already. But that being said, Microsoft has released no games of note. Yeah, sure, I'll give you that to an extent. No, I've made it no secret that I think Microsoft is the most incompetent company in the industry when it comes to studio management. And that's why there's something like a dozen first-party Xbox Studios games that we have no idea where they are. We don't know where Gear 6 is, we don't know where Fable is, we don't know where Perfect Dark is. But to suggest that that's all because of the Activision deal? No, that's not how this works. Like, you're really reaching for your argument here. You're really reaching in your whole setup here. And I wonder why that is. I wonder what your solution to this whole fiasco is going to be. Imagine that the Activision Blizzard deal doesn't go through and Microsoft has wasted all that time, money, and effort on nothing. I would imagine there are going to be some serious questions asked of boss Phil Spencer, who, as one reader pointed out this week, has been in charge of Xbox for almost a decade now. While he usually says all the right things, he has little to show for his time in charge except a bunch of new developers that haven't released anything yet. Also, yes, I changed release to released when I read this out loud because there are a million typos in this fucking thing. I understand that it was like a reader entry article, but you could have proofread it at least once. And since I am fully aware of the kind of person who's writing this, let me make something very clear. In big, giant, multi-billion-dollar companies like this, one person is not responsible for all of the bad things. You may want to pin all of your frustrations with Xbox on Phil Spencer, but that's just not how this works. Phil Spencer is not sitting in at the fucking bat computer, clicking on the keyboard and deciding every single Xbox related decision. But also, if you want to blame all the shit stuff on Phil Spencer, you also have to say Phil Spencer was responsible for basically completely reviving Xbox after the launch of the Xbox One, for reformatting the Xbox ecosystem, for coming up with Game Pass, for doing the big PC push, for pushing for crossplay. Again, Phil Spencer was not solely responsible for any of those things. But if you want to pin the negative things solely on him, you have to pin all the good things, again, solely on him. Which I know you're not willing to do. So why do even part of it? You're just making yourself sound even more partisan and less informed. Microsoft, as a wider company, is currently obsessed with ChatGPT and the fact that Bing is finally relevant and being used by people. It's easy to forget how massive Microsoft is and how gaming is just a tiny part of what they do, and in terms of profits, completely irrelevant. Oh my god, gaming profits are not completely irrelevant. If it was completely irrelevant, they would stop doing it. Here is how much money Xbox generates for Microsoft. That is a not inconsequential amount of money. Like, yeah, Microsoft is worth a lot more money than that, but by literally any standard of business, this is still an absurd amount of money. Do you understand what I'm saying here? And do you understand why I made such a stink earlier in the video about just because they're not as successful as other things or other companies doesn't mean they're not successful. If Xbox continues to show little growth, okay, what is your source on them having little growth? Did no one proofread this? What is your source on them showing little growth? Look at the number of Game Pass subscribers they have. Look at the number of Xbox consoles, of Series consoles, that have been sold in just the last 2 years. Xbox is doing perfectly fine. And what do you have to say about the growth of Xbox players on PC thanks to games like the Master Chief Collection, or, really just Xbox games on PC in general, and Game Pass on PC in general? Xbox is absolutely expanding their reach. I don't know where you're getting this idea that they're showing little growth. They've changed their business strategy. Growth looks different now than it did a couple of years ago, but that doesn't mean there's no growth. Okay, where was I? If Xbox continues to show little growth and the gamble on buying Activision Blizzard doesn't pay off, I think some serious questions are going to be asked, just as they apparently were following the failure of the Xbox One. Going back to what I said earlier, the Xbox One flopped at launch, and then it redeemed itself a few years later, similar to how the PS3 flopped at launch and then redeemed itself a few years later. A company doing a very highly publicized stupid thing and then making a comeback, that's not uncommon, like, at all. Mockable, absolutely, but uncommon? No. My answer to these questions would be simple. Oh, here we go. Here's the good part. My answer to these questions would be simple. Sell the Xbox business to Sony. Yes. Because when in doubt, create monopolies. They may be a much smaller company than Microsoft. Yeah, so how would they fucking afford it? They may be a much smaller company than Microsoft, but the Xbox division is well within their ability to afford, especially if it's being sold off because it's in trouble. Again, where do you get the idea that Xbox is in trouble? Little reminder of how much money Microsoft is paying to buy Activision Blizzard. They just whipped this money out like it was nothing. Microsoft is spending this much money on Activision Blizzard to be incorporated into Xbox. So how much money do you think Xbox is actually going to be sold for in your fantasy situation here? You may say that Microsoft should sell it to Google or Amazon or some other mega corporation. Yeah, because they could afford it. But those are Microsoft's direct competition. Sony isn't. Are you fucking serious? You really don't think Sony is Microsoft's competitor? Like, yeah, Microsoft as a company is competing with Google and Amazon, but Xbox as a brand is competing with Sony directly. Like, how could you even suggest that Microsoft doesn't see Sony as a competitor? Of course they do. Sony is one of the only things standing in Microsoft's way to being the #1 name in gaming. For like the 50th time, just because Xbox isn't as successful as something else in the gaming brand doesn't mean they are irrelevant. As a relatively small player on a global scale, Sony should be Microsoft's ally, not enemy. So naturally, buy the whole thing and create a monopoly. The Xbox was created because Microsoft didn't want Sony to, quote, take control of the living room, but that concept is now completely outdated. Okay, I know Nintendo exists, but to quote Yahtzee Crowshot, they're basically like just eating gummy bears in a space helmet while Microsoft and Sony are doing the actual heavy lifting of console gaming. If Xbox were sold to Sony, Sony would absolutely have a monopoly over like home console gaming. This is not what you want, and this is not good for gamers by any stretch of the imagination. The reason the Xbox was created is no longer relevant. The reason the PlayStation was created is no longer relevant. Who gives a shit? These brands are decades old. Of course the reason they were created is no longer relevant. The industry changes over decades. I would hope the reason they were created is no longer relevant because that would mean that the industry has not moved in 30 years. Oh my god, the reason the Xbox was created is no longer relevant, and so Microsoft should just do what it usually does in these situations, buy a company with more experience. It tried to buy both Sega and Nintendo, or if that fails, team up with them instead. I guess they could buy Sony, but I would imagine a failure to acquire Activision Blizzard would quickly put them off that idea, especially with monopoly investigators still breathing down their necks. I don't understand this. So Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard gets monopoly investigators breathing down their necks. Sony buying Xbox doesn't. Are you alive? Because the fact that this is just flying over your head is like, yikes. Sell the PlayStation business to Sony and they could still keep their finger in the pie, selling them access to their streaming services. They already have a deal to work together on that, and perhaps helping out with other technical aspects like console and controller design. Sell the PlayStation business to Sony. Bro, are you well? And again, to Metro, one-on-one to metro.co.uk. Do you have an editor anywhere on the premises? Microsoft could continue to research and develop game streaming and sell it to not just Sony, but other companies, even Google, because Google has done such good work in the gaming industry. I sure hope they take another crack at it. They could become a support studio, as it were, for other games companies and interested parties. Is that different from what Microsoft is doing now with Xbox Game Studios? Like, they're a supporter of other game companies and interested parties. What? Maybe they could even retain a developer or two and still make some of their own games, although one of the obvious choices for that is Halo, and they've made such a hash of that lately, they're probably better off making sure that's the first thing they sell. I like how you could take this paragraph, change the word Microsoft to Activision, and change the word Halo to COD, and suddenly it's the worst thing in the world to you. I'm sure Microsoft isn't interested in the opinion of a nobody on the internet, especially one who doesn't notice the little red lines under the things they're writing in Microsoft Word, but I wouldn't be surprised if something similar to what I've said hasn't floated through the minds of at least a few execs, or at least some shareholders. Yeah, the only thing going through the minds of execs and shareholders at Microsoft right now is, wow, Sony is being a little bitch, can someone shut them up please? Xbox isn't working out at the moment, and this idea of Microsoft playing the long game is getting out of hand. If it gets any longer, consoles won't exist anymore, and holodecks will be real before they manage to get themselves into gear. God, this was dumb. This was dumb. Look, Microsoft is going to buy Activision. It's going to go through. There are no grounds against it. Microsoft is also making plenty of money with Xbox, and the Xbox brand, the Xbox services, Xbox Game Studios, they may not be doing as well as we would want them to be, because, you know, as much as I am annoyed by Xbox and Microsoft, nobody benefits from them sucking. You know, everyone benefits from there being good, solid competition in the gaming industry, so obviously I want Xbox to succeed, the same way that I genuinely want Sony to improve and succeed and push things forward as much as they annoy me. But just to suggest that Sony is, first of all, to suggest that Sony is in any situation where they could realistically buy Xbox as a brand, Jesus Christ. To suggest that the Xbox brand would ever be sold to its direct competitor, Jesus Christ Part 2. To suggest that Microsoft and Sony are not competitors to any capacity, Jesus Christ Part 3. This whole thing just reads like a bitter PlayStation fan who's upset about the fact that Microsoft is now using Sony's tactics against them, all while giving them a million different off-ramps and a million different pieces of insurance along the way. And once that deal goes through, I'm sure we can start to see more, more attention, more resources put towards Xbox Game Studios. I don't want to put too much stock in that because they've done nothing but disappoint me so far. As a longtime fan of Halo and Gears of War, I am definitely no fan of Xbox's studio management right now. But you know what the fun thing about business is? If a business strategy doesn't work, it has to change. And if you're a company as big and valuable as Microsoft, you are fully aware of that. You want to talk about Phil Spencer? I mean, Phil Spencer himself just came out and just flat out said that. It was earlier this year or late last year. He just flat out said that 2022 sucked, which was like, it doesn't excuse the fact that 2022 sucked, but it was at least nice to hear. I have very little confidence in Microsoft studio management, but at least I don't suggest monopolies to fix it, so I can at least take solace in that. Anyways, toodles.